Happy Monday, everyone, and welcome back to a new week of Reading the Book Thief. We are in part 5, and we are starting with Rudy's youth. In the end, she had to give it to him. He knew how to perform. A Portrait of Rudy Steiner, July 1941. Strings of mud clench his face. His tie is a pendulum, long dead in its clock. His lemon, lamp-lit hair is disheveled, and he wears a sad, absurd smile. He stood a few meters from the step and spoke with great conviction, great joy. Alles ist scheiße, he announced. All is shit. The first half of 1941, while Liesel went about the business of concealing Max Vandenberg, stealing newspapers, and telling off mayors' wives, Rudy was enduring a new life of his own at the Hitler Youth. Since early February, he'd been returning from the meetings in a considerably worse state than he'd left in. On many of those return trips, Tommy Mueller was by his side in the same condition. The trouble had three elements to it, a triple-tiered problem. One, Tommy Mueller's ears. Two, Franz Deutscher, the irate Hitler Youth leader. And three, Rudy's inability to stay out of things. If only Tommy Mueller hadn't disappeared for 7 hours on one of the coldest days in Munich's history 6 years earlier. His ear infections and nerve damage were still contorting the marching pattern at the Hitler Youth, which I can assure you was not a positive thing. To begin with, the downward slide of momentum was gradual, but as the months progressed, Tommy was consistently gathering the ire of the Hitler Youth leaders, especially when it came to the marching. Remember Hitler's birthday the previous year? For some time, the ear infections were getting worse. They had reached the point where Tommy had genuine problems hearing. He could not make out the commands that were shouted at the group as they marched in line. It didn't matter if it was in the hall or outside, in the snow or in mud, or the slits of rain. The goal was always to have everyone stop at the same time. One click, they were told. That's all the Fuhrer wants to hear. Everyone united, everyone together as one. Then Tommy. It was his left ear, I think. That was the most troublesome of the two. And then when the bitter cry of halt wet the ears of everybody else, Tommy marched comically and obliviously on. He could transform a marching line into a dog's breakfast in a blink of an eye. On one particular Saturday at the beginning of July, just after 3:30, and a litany of Tommy-inspired failed marching attempts, Franz Deutscher, the ultimate name for the ultimate teenage Nazi, was completely fed up. Mueller, du Affe. His thick blonde hair massaged his head, and his words manipulated Tommy's face. You ape! What's wrong with you? Tommy slouched fearfully back, but his left cheek still managed to twitch in a manic, cheerful contortion. He appeared not only to be laughing with a triumphant smirk, but accepting the bucketing with glee. And Franz Deutscher wasn't having any of it. His pale eyes cooked him. Well, he asked, what can you say for yourself? Tommy's twitch only increased in both speed and depth. Are you mocking me? Heil, twitched Tommy, in a desperate attempt to buy some approval, but it did not make it to the Hitler part. That was when Rudy stepped forward. He faced Franz Deutscher, looking up at him. He's got a problem, sir. I can see that. With his ears, Rudy finished. He can't. Right, that's it. Deutscher rubbed his hands together. Both of you, 6 slaps of the grounds. They obeyed, but not fast enough. Snell! His voice chased him. When the 6 slaps were completed, they were given some drills of the run, drop down, get up, get down again variety. And after 15 very long minutes, they were ordered to the ground for what should have been the last time. Rudy looked down. A warped circle of mud grinned up at him. What might you be looking at? It seemed to ask. Down, Franz ordered. Rudy naturally jumped over it and dropped to his stomach. Up, Franz smiled. 1 step back. They did it. Down. The message was clear now. Rudy accepted it. He dived at the mud and held his breath, and at the moment, lying ear to sodden earth, the drill ended. Violent Dank, meine Herren, Franz Deutscher politely said. Many thanks, my gentlemen. Rudy climbed to his knees, did some gardening in his ear, and looked across at Tommy. Tommy closed his eyes, and he twitched. When they returned to Hemel Street that day, Lisa was playing hopscotch with some of the younger kids, still in her BDM uniform. From the corner of her eye, she saw the two melancholic figures walking toward her. One of them called out. They met on the front step of the Steiner's concrete shoebox of a house, and Rudy told her all about the day's episode. After 10 minutes, Liesel sat down. After 11 minutes, Tommy, who was sitting next to her, said, It's all my fault. But Rudy waved him away, somewhere between sentence and smile, chopping the mud streak in half with his finger. It's my. Tommy tried again, but Rudy broke the sentence completely and pointed at him. Tommy, please. There was a peculiar look of contentment on Rudy's face. Lisa had never seen someone so miserable yet so wholeheartedly alive. Just sit there and twitch or something. And he continued with the story. He paced. He wrestled his tie. The words were flying at her, landing somewhere on the concrete step. That Deutscher, he summed up buoyantly. He got us, huh, Tommy? Tommy nodded, twitched, and spoke, not necessarily in that order. It was because of me. Tommy, what did I say? When? Now. Just keep quiet. Sure, Rudy. When Tommy walked forlornly home a short while later, Rudy tried what appeared to be a masterful new tactic pity. On the step, he perused the mud that had dried as a crusty sheet on his uniform, then looked Liesel hopelessly in the face. What about it, Samich? What about what? You know. Liesel responded in the usual fashion. Sockel, she laughed, and she walked the short distance home. A disconcerting mixture of mud and pity was one thing, but kissing Rudy Steiner was something entirely different. Smiling sadly on the step, he called out, rummaging a hand through his hair. One day, he warned her. One day, Liesel. In the basement just over 2 years later, Liesel ached sometimes to go next door and see him, even if she was writing in the early hours of morning. She also realized it was most likely those sodden days at Hitler Youth that had fed his, and subsequently her own, desire for crime. After all, despite the usual bouts of rain, summer was beginning to arrive properly. The Klar apples should have been ripening. There was more stealing to be done. Next chapter is The Losers. When it came to stealing, Liesel and Rudy first stuck with the idea that there was safety in numbers. Andy Schmeichel invited them to the river for a meeting. Among other things, a game plan for fruit stealing would be on the agenda. So, are you the leader now? Rudy had asked, but Andy shook his head, heavy with disappointment. He clearly wished that he had what it took. No, his cool voice was unusually warm, half baked. There's someone else. The new Arthur Berg. He had windy hair and cloudy eyes, and he was the kind of delinquent who had no other reason to steal except that he enjoyed it. His name was Victor Chemmel. Unlike most people engaged in the various arts of thievery, Victor Chemmel had it all. He lived in the best part of Mulching, high up in a villa that had been fumigated when the Jews were driven out. He had money, he had cigarettes. What he wanted, however, was more. No crime is wanting a little more, he claimed, lying back in the grass with a collection of boys assembled around him. Wanting more is our fundamental right as Germans. What does our Fuhrer say? He answered his own rhetoric. We must take what is rightfully ours. At face value, Victor Chemmel was clearly your typical teenage bullshit artist. Unfortunately, when he felt like revealing it, he also possessed a certain charisma, a kind of follow me. When Liesel and Rudy approached the group by the river, she heard him ask another question. So, where are these two deviants you've been bragging about? It's 4:10 already. Not by my watch, said Rudy. Victor Chemmel propped himself up on an elbow. You're not wearing a watch. Would I be here if I was rich enough to own a watch? The new leader sat up fully and smiled, with straight white teeth. He then turned his casual focus onto the girl. Who's the little whore? Liesel, well accustomed to verbal abuse, simply watched the fog-ridden texture of her eyes. Last year, she listed, I stole at least 300 apples and dozens of potatoes. I have a little trouble with barbed wire fences, and I can keep up with anyone here. Is that right? Yes. She did not shrink or step away. All I ask is a small part of anything we take. A dozen apples here or there, a few leftovers for me and my friend. Well, I suppose it can be arranged. Victor lit a cigarette and raised it to his mouth. He made a concerted effort to blow his next mouthful in Liesel's face. Liesel did not cough. It was the same group as the previous year, the only exception being the leader. Liesel wondered why none of the other boys had assumed the helm, but looking from face to face, she realized none of them had it. They had no qualms about staying, but they needed to be told. They liked to be told, and Victor Chemmel liked to be the teller. It was a nice microcosm. For a moment, Liesel longed for the reappearance of Arthur Berg, or would he too have fallen under the leadership of Chemmel? Didn't matter. Liesel only knew that Arthur Berg did not have a tyrannical bone in his body, whereas the new leader had hundreds of them. Last year, she knew that if she was stuck in a tree, Arthur would come back for her, despite claiming otherwise. This year, by comparison, she was instantly aware that Victor Chemmel wouldn't even bother to look back. He stood, regarding the lanky boy and the malnourished-looking girl. So, you want to steal with me? What do they have to lose? They nodded. He stepped closer and grabbed Rudy's hair. I want to hear it. Definitely, Rudy said, before being shoved back, fringe first. And you? Of course. Lisa was quick enough to avoid the same treatment. Victor smiled. He squashed his cigarette, breathed deeply in, and scratched his chest. My gentleman, my whore, it looks like it's time to go shopping. As the group walked off, Liesel and Rudy were at the back, as they'd always been in the past. Do you like him? Rudy whispered. Do you? Rudy paused a moment. I think he's a complete bastard. Me too. The group was getting away from them. Come on, Rudy said. We've fallen behind. After a few miles, they reached the first farm. What greeted them was a shock. The trees they'd imagined to be swollen with fruit were frail and injured looking, with only a small array of apples hanging miserly from each branch. The next farm was the same. Maybe it was a bad season, or their timing wasn't quite right. By the end of the afternoon, when the spoils were handed out, Liesel and Rudy were given one diminutive apple between them. In fairness, the takings were incredibly poor, but Victor Chemmel also ran a tighter ship. What do you call this? Rudy asked. The apple rested in his palm. Victor didn't even turn around. What does it look like? The words were dropped over his shoulder. One lousy apple? Here. A half-eaten one was also tossed their way, landing chewed side down in the dirt. Can have that one, too. Rudy was incensed. To hell with this. We didn't walk 10 miles for 1.5 scrawny apples, did we, Liesel? Liesel did not answer. She did not have time, for Victor Chemmel was on top of Rudy before she could utter a word. His knees had pinned Rudy's arms, and his hands were around his throat. The apples were scooped up by none other than Andy Schmeichel at Victor's request. You're hurting him, Liesel said. Am I? Victor was smiling again. She hated that smile. He's not hurting me. Rudy's words were rushed together, then his face was red with strain. His nose began to bleed. After an extended moment or two of increased pressure, Victor let Rudy go and climbed off him, taking a few careless steps. He said, Get up, boy. And Rudy, choosing wisely, did as he was told. Victor came casually closer again and faced him. He gave him a gentle rub on the arm. A whisper. Unless you want me to turn that blood into a fountain, I suggest you go away, little boy. He looked at Liesel. And take the little slut with you. No one moved. Well, what are you waiting for? Liesel took Rudy's hand and they left, but not before Rudy turned one last time and spat some blood and saliva at Victor Chemel's feet. It evoked one final remark. A small threat from Victor Chemel to Rudy Steiner. You'll pay for that at a later date, my friend. Say what you will about Victor Chemel, but he certainly had patience and a good memory. It took him approximately 5 months to turn his statement into a true one. We'll do one more. Sketches. In the summer of 1941, if the summer of 1941 was walling up around the likes of Rudy and Liesel, it was writing and painting itself into the life of Max Vandenberg. In his loneliest moments in the basement, the words started piling up around him. The visions began to pour and fall and occasionally limp from out of his hands. He had what he called just a small ration of tools: a painted book, a handful of pencils, a mind full of thoughts. Like a simple puzzle, he put them together. Originally, Max had intended to write his own story. The idea was to write about everything that happened to him, all that had led him to a Himmel Street basement. But it was not what came out. Max's exile produced something else entirely. It was a collection of random thoughts, and he chose to embrace them. They felt true. They were more real than the letters he wrote to his family and to his friend Walter Kugler, knowing very well that he could never send them. The desecrated pages of Mein Kampf were becoming a series of sketches, page after page, which to him summed up the events that had swapped his former life for another. Some took minutes, others hours. He resolved that when the book was finished, he'd give it to Liesel when she was old enough, and hopefully when all this nonsense was over. For the moment he tested the pencils on the first painted page, he kept the book close at all times. Often, it was next to him or still in his figures as he slept. One afternoon, after his push-ups and sit-ups, he fell asleep against the basement wall. When Liesel came down, she found the book sitting next to him, slanted against his thigh, and curiosity got the better of her. She leaned over and picked it up, waiting for him to stir. He didn't. Max was sitting with his head and shoulder blades against the wall. She could barely make out the sounds of his breath, coasting in and out of him, as she opened the book and glimpsed a few random pages. Not the Fuhrer, the conductor. Let's see. There it is. Oop, well, let's see. There, that way. And then, isn't it a lovely day? Frightened by what she saw, Liesel placed the book back down exactly as she found it, against Max's leg. A voice startled her. Dankeschön, it said, and when she looked across, following the trail of sound to its odor, a small sign of satisfaction was present on his Jewish lips. Holy Christ, Liesel gasped. You scared me, Max. He returned to his sleep, and behind her, the girl dragged the same thought up the steps. You scared me, Max. We'll stop there, and we will talk to you again on Tuesday. Enjoy your Monday.